Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, Cal. He's really working on his jazz chords. It's time for a tired review, which is where I review an album even though I'm tired. And this particular one's gonna be a doozy, because for some reason I came out with about 2 times more notes than I usually do with an average album review. And in this review, we're going to be talking about the new Krallice LP, Years Past Matter. Krallice is a New York progressive metal outfit with a special ingredient added to their mixture: black metal. The American black metal scene has been under a bit of scrutiny over the past 5 to 6 years because of bands that take a more atmospheric approach, maybe just a less standard approach when it comes to the black metal genre. Wolves in the Throne Room, Liturgy, and Krallice is also in that group. And the backlash that a lot of these bands have seen is really no surprise. I mean, black metal historically is a very insular culture. The American bands I just listed could be writing carbon copies of Darkthrone records, and black metal purists would still be scoffing at them. And yeah, I'm sure partially it has to do with the fact that these guys are changing the formula. They're changing essentially what the music means, what the music is about and sounds like, but also another thing that comes up is image. Black metal is a very image obsessed culture. As image obsessed as the other musical cultures, it perceives itself to be different than, I'm sure. And a bunch of dudes from New York City with backgrounds in avant and progressive and experimental metal projects isn't exactly the kind of appearance that originators and longtime fans want attached to the tremolo pick guitars and the retched vocals and the blast beats that at one time represented something that was very occult, very murderous, something that really kind of reveled in its obscurity. A style of music that carries this much baggage is not going to be integrated into the grand scheme of things easily. And you see that in the hipster tag that gets thrown on a lot of these American black metal groups. I mean, just sort of throw this image on them that is supposed to be very far removed from the Nordic musicians that kind of brought this style into the beloved sound it is today. And I will agree with that tag to an extent. You know, at first when these American black metal bands started rising up, being blogged about, it became kind of a trendy thing. You know, ooh, black metal from America, even though it's not entirely a brand new thing, to a lot of people it was. And I think it's easy to assume 5 years later a lot of the novelty has worn off at this point. I like to think anybody who's still following US-made black metal is listening to it because they're authentically interested in the sound. And I would like to think that's especially true in the case of Krallice. They have just released one dense, long, challenging album after another. Not really the kind of music that is rewarding with cursory listening that people may be giving to more atmospheric and repetitive black metal albums. Krallice's tracks are just an onslaught of blast beats, technically proficient walls of guitar, dishing out layers of tremolo picked leads, bass lines, chords, and together they create some of the most interesting, dissonant, beautiful and moving harmonies and melodies in metal music today. Now, when it comes to the composition of their tracks, Krallice kind of tends to jump from one riff or melody or passage to another at a speed that makes all of it kind of difficult to process on the first listen, on the second listen, on the third listen. The 10-minute epics that these guys write are very impressive. And the musicality and the composition is really where the variation that this band brings, the creativity that this band brings is at. Because over the course of all their LPs, they have remained very consistent stylistically. I mean, to the point where if you didn't like their first album or their second album, you're pretty much tuning out at this point. Or maybe even if you enjoyed their earlier work, kind of getting tired of the fact that they're really kind of just sticking to their guns and just really kind of putting out the same style. And, you know, I will admit, I will say Krallice's style is not for everyone. It will wear you down, even if you're interested in hearing it. I do think they show some progress and maybe a little bit more variation than usual on this new LP, but I still think enjoying this album as a whole, enjoying this album, loving this album, really hinders on your ability to just digest what they're doing musically. Like I said, Krallice is really a combination of progressive rock and black metal, with more of the former than the latter. And maybe they're not put together in a way that is the best pairing of them, or maybe not the best pairing of them, but the kind of pairing of them that is going to necessarily attract listeners. For one, there's just a lot of technical precision to what Krallice does, and the way they write their tracks, it's just like an endless segue, one phase after another, trying to repeat as little as possible. And they dress their compositions in these tremolo pick guitars, in the blast beats, in vocals that are both deep, loud, kind of throaty coming from down here, but also retched or just like these tortured screams. I know Mick Barr kind of handles the higher registers of the vocals on Krallice's LPs. The beats from the drums have a lot of ambience on them, as if all the drums are recorded at a distance. The vocals sound like they're recorded even further away from the microphone, and the guitars are up front, really kind of bleeding into one another. I do think this is really Krallice's best recorded album yet. I do think there were some moments on their last LP, Diotima, that were a little muddy, were a little bit more lo-fi. I think Krallice kind of teeters between being hi-fi and lo-fi. Krallice's instruments ring through really clear, especially with the bass. I mean, you were hearing a lot of bass on this record, especially on one track I was catching bass arpeggios, or you'll really kind of catch the bass playing a variation or some counterpoint to whatever the guitars are doing. I mean, some nice bass on this thing. But still, Krallice, the way they record their albums, it's still a huge reference to those older black metal records, how things are positioned in the mix. I personally feel like there's a lot of sincerity in what Krallice does with black metal. I feel like they love black metal. They love these older black metal records, and they're just kind of taking the avant-garde and experimental approaches that dudes like Mick Barr and Colin Marson in this band have taken with their other projects and just applying it to this genre. The thing is, this very rough and harsh and abrasive black metal sound, this black metal style, isn't exactly the easiest thing to digest when you pair it with these really dense compositions that Krallice produces. One kind of suffers at the hand of the other, but maybe not in a way where they both feel terrible, but are just difficult. I mean, just difficult, like solving a Rubik's Cube with your feet difficult. And even though Krallice and Years Past Matter are tough, I mean, they are tough, they're not impossible. It's not like you cannot commit these tracks to memory. It's not like there aren't standout moments. I love the introduction to the first track on here. It has a really nice atmosphere to it before it just kicks in with these blast beats, and then it just kind of goes into zero gravity as the drums just kind of just disappear and the guitars lay on these heavenly layered harmonies. And I'm also kind of catching some synths in the mix on this thing, which, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of a new thing for Krallice. There are some atmospheric spots on this album, like the intro to the first track. There is a bit of feedback, some drone a little bit on the end of the second track. There is very airy and ethereal ambience on the end of the third track too, and the fourth track has kind of an easy in as well. And the fifth track is a very noisy, kind of dissonant ambient moment too, lasts about 2 minutes, lots of cymbals and guitar feedback on this thing. I mean, ambience is really kind of the new addition to Krallice's repertoire, and they're really incorporating it into their tracks pretty well. Mostly at the intros and outros, I wish it kind of showed up in the middle of some songs a little bit more. It would have brought more dynamics to these tracks, but still, it's a cool addition. So you do kind of get these atmospheric or ambient intros and outros, but the middles of these songs, the centers of them, it's just immensely intense hellfire. There's even a spot on the second track where I'm catching these really fast rising climaxes where the guitars are just strumming really fast at the very peak. Really kind of reminds me of what Liturgy was doing on their last LP. And if that is inspired a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised considering Colin Marson did do production on that Liturgy record. But hey, you know, it could be a two-way street with them. I know both bands are very conscious of what the other is doing. Later in that second track, those bass arpeggios that I mentioned are there, and I just have a hell of a time going through this song and just kind of pulling apart and listening to these winding, just unpredictable passages that Krallice has pulled together. Lots of nooks and crannies in this track, and some moments that to me are just powerful. And the melodic theme that they break into on the 7-minute mark of this track, I mean, surprising change and a great just section. The especially intense and fast soloing in the middle of the third track and the ambient outro are enough to make that song stick out to me. Track 4 has a very slow introduction and builds up, escalates nicely. There's a very dramatic ending on this song, some syncopated starts and stops, very thematic riffs, and the closer, which is a 16-minute beast, totally justifies its ending with maybe the most variation on any track here, and a spot toward the end where, man, it gets so melodic, it almost reminds me of like video game music on the NES. Bottom line, Krallice is a progressive metal band. They are a progressive metal band, period. They just kind of use black metal as a veneer for their progressive style. And this works for me personally. I mean, this works a lot for me because I feel like a lot of modern progressive rock and progressive metal is just too clean sounding, too sanitary, just too groomed to really be rock music. To me, rock instinctively has to have some kind of edge. I mean, maybe Krallice's edge is a little too sharp for some people, but you know, not for me. Now, if there are some negatives to this album and just Krallice's style to me in general, I feel like they can be just maybe a little too dense, a little too obtuse for somebody who's not exactly already into black metal. But that kind of goes against what I said earlier, because a lot of people who are longtime black metal fans aren't necessarily going to jump onto this with excitement because Krallice does kind of bend a lot of rules. I still think with some production that is slightly clearer, maybe with the guitars bleeding into each other a bit less, Krallice's music would be easier to digest. And sometimes there are moments, especially on track 3, where I feel like Krallice is just throwing so many guitar leads, just so many solos, just so many sounds into this wall of guitars that they're building, that some magic, some musical ideas that they're fooling around with kind of get lost. And while I do think this is one of Krallice's more varied efforts yet, I mean, as long as they're incorporating these ambient and just sort of drony elements to these tracks, I mean, I feel like they could always incorporate more variation. I mean, while I do think they are kind of very, very good at incorporating, very good at bringing compositional variation, I mean, a lot of musical ideas flying in at every direction on this thing, I do feel like they could use more variation in the intensity department. Despite all those complaints, I still think Krallice is a very impressive and great band that has something special with what they're doing. Sure, you know, they haven't exactly been reinventing themselves with every album they have released. They're one of those artists that instead of just kind of throwing the whole blueprint out and starting over again, they're just fine-tuning, tilting things this way, just twisting knobs slightly. Though Krallice does have a black metal element to their style, I don't necessarily think this is just for black metal fans. I mean, you have to have an appreciation for progressive, you know, progressive structures and long-winded tracks in order to really like this, because even though Krallice does have a black metal sound, it's going to get old for you. I mean, you have to like the melodies, you have to appreciate the playing that goes into this record to really like it. If that's not your thing, there are plenty of black metal records out there that are just kind of going for more of a mood. I mean, Krallice is not really just a mood album. It's not really just mood music. It is just straight in your face playing and intensity. It is relentless. It is compositional strength command and creativity. Overall, feeling a strong 8 to a light 9 on this album. I mean, I haven't enjoyed Krallice this much since their debut album, and I'm glad to be kind of in a position where I'm loving their music again. If you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it, hate it, why? What should I review next? And yeah, that's about it. That's about it. Anthony Fantano, Krallice, forever.